This is the ethical, building an ethical culture in your organization presentation by Dr. Richard Kite. Richard Kite is the endowed professor of ethics at Viterbo University and serves as director of the D.B. Reinhardt Institute for Ethics and Leadership. He is the author of several books, including An Ethical Life, Practical Guide to Ethical Reasoning and Ethical Business, Cultivating the Good in an Organizational Culture. He is a regular columnist for the newspapers and co-host of the Ethical Life podcast. His latest book, Finding Your Third Place, will be available in June from Bolt Publishing. Dr. Richard Kite.
Thank you very much, Chris. Good morning. And if I'm speaking at this level, can you all hear me, or anybody prefer that I use a microphone?
The tech team prefers you use it.
Thank you for saying
It requires me that I use both hands at the same time. But I've been passing around a handout here that's going to be the centerpiece of this presentation. Does anybody not have a copy of this? Okay, here you go. Anybody else need a copy? Okay, great, thank you. And then there's one right here, okay. I'll be referring to this over and over. I've been teaching ethics for about 30 years, and the way I was taught to teach ethics, and the way that most of us who are in this profession are taught, is that it's mainly about how do we make individual decisions? How do we approach something that's complicated, that has, say, effects on different people in different ways or might be controversial? How do we think through what are the best options and come to a good decision? And when I started working with in the university where I am now, Viterbo University, started working with a program that we developed called the Master's Program in Servant Leadership, where we had people from many different professions, both for-profit, not-for-profit, coming from many different backgrounds. We had a lot of discussions about what they were doing in their organizations. And one of the things I realized is that the people who came from the most effective organizations were hardly ever making decisions on their own. They had really strong networks of people to draw from. And I started thinking about my own case. When I was in graduate school, my wife and I were running a miniature golf course every summer. We would drive from Baltimore, where we were in grad school, all the way across the country to Colorado. We had a little mini golf course we would run for 3 months. And we would encounter all kinds of ethical problems, even in a small business like that. We hired a number of high school students who would work for us, for example, and I had one young man who seemed to be very bad at math, and every time he would work, the cash drawer was always off, somewhere between like $15 and $40. Well, we did everything we could to help him out, but he was always off. Now, if it was positive, 15 or 40, no problem, but it was always negative. We didn't know if he was stealing from us or he just couldn't add. We did everything we could. Like what do you do in that case? And then what do you do in the case where it's not only seemed to be a nice enough guy, I think he was just making mistakes, but he's also he's the son of my father-in-law's good friend. Well, that makes it harder. So you run into these ethical problems, and it wasn't just that. We'd run in situations all the time, and I realized the last thing I would do is think back to what did Immanuel Kant say about this? How do we apply the categorical imperative? Didn't do that. I would end up talking to people who had some experience in that area. Like, what do you do when you have an employee who's struggling? How do you handle this? What if you don't know if they're being honest or if they're just incompetent? Do they need some help? Do they just, what's going on? How do you handle it? And I realize for all my life, I've been relying on people that I would trust, that had some experience in area. And different people I'd go to in different situations and ask, what do you think? What's your advice? And then I started paying more attention to what about big issues in society? Like what's going on? When we have an ethical problem that it makes the media and questions come up, say like a door plug falls out of an airplane, just to take a random example. You know, when this sort of thing happens, what do? Well, the first thing we do is try to like figure out like who's to blame, right? Well, it turns out in a lot of these cases, you can find somebody, say, who didn't install the bolts properly. But then what if you find out that there's an ongoing problem where all sorts of things were regularly being overlooked, where like things weren't being installed properly, but then they also weren't being inspected properly? What if you find out in looking back, and this happens to be the case with Boeing, they've had a number of incidents over the last several years, and it's not only that, when you talk to people on the factory floor, they're saying, like, years ago, we used to be able to say, stop, there's a problem here. And I'd tell your manager, tell your supervisor, we've got an issue, and they would stop it and figure out what's going on. We can't do that anymore. The company culture is different. Well, then, does that change how you think about who's to blame for something? And started realizing that in most cases, where we're talking about organizations that are fairly complex, what we identify as ethical problems isn't usually the result of one person. And it's not easy to find a person to blame. It's usually that you can tell where there's a problem with the culture. And when we say a problem with the culture, we mean mainly there's a problem with people not talking to one another, without being honest, without hearing or understanding one another. Something's going on there with the normal process of conversation, so that ethical decision-making, which operates best when we have the ability to talk to somebody and say, you know, I'm not sure how to handle this. I think I know what's going on, or maybe I know, but I've got some ideas. I want to get your advice, get your feedback. That kind of normal process of human interaction gets interrupted. And we find that all over. And I'll just give you these couple of examples. Here's the condominium collapse in Florida. And when we look back and say, well, what caused it? It's not just one person, but there's a number of things. Like there was an issue with the design of the building. There's an issue with the amount of the rebar was installed, was not. So there might have been some payoff or some corruption among contractors. But what about the inspections that were supposed to catch that? What about the deterioration of the seawall and the quality of the concrete? There's multiple problems. There's not just one. And when there's multiple problems like this, you can say, well, it's a cultural problem. It's not just an individual. And then we have problems like this, where a couple years ago, there was this memorial service for people who had been killed in traffic accidents in Springfield, Massachusetts. And here in the Midwest, we probably didn't hear about this, but it turns out if we look back over the past 10 years, Springfield, Massachusetts has had as many traffic fatalities as Boston. Springfield, Massachusetts is not that big compared to Boston. Why is that? What's going on? And I'll give you an example. This isn't something that's been really talked about a lot by Charles Marone of Strong Towns, is the example of one particular street. And this street was widened from a 2-lane street to 4-lane to improve traffic flow. It's classified as a state highway, so that's as a state Department of Transportation was in charge of improving traffic flow. But you have both city and county government involved as well, because you've got a county building over here with a city library, public library inside that building. And if you look right here, you'll see steps coming down. This is the main entrance to the library. And it used to be parking along here with a crosswalk and then entrance into this library. And you can see the parking lot over here. with a four lane, when they went to a 4-lane and they went from stop signs to street lights that are down here and then back where this photo is being taken from, they got rid of that crosswalk, and to discourage traffic or people from cross the street, they put some hedges here and they put hedges along the parking lot. But of course, when you ask, well, what's going to happen if people are parked right here and they've got to enter the building in the middle of the block? What are they going to do? A lot of people are going to come right across the street anyway. The other thing you can ask, what's going to happen to the speed of traffic? Speed limit is the same because it's in the city, but you don't have parking on each side. Now you have a 4-lane street, speed's going to go up. Within a couple months of this renovation here, this change in the street, there was a accident. A mother with 2 young children had taken her children to the library after school in the winter, came out, it was raining, it's cold, it's raining, and it's just getting dark. Looks both ways, no traffic is coming. She walks across. Instead of going all the way down to the street light and around in the rain with her young children, she takes them across the street. A car made a turn on a red light after stopping on the red, turns, and immediately speeds up. It's dark and it's raining and there's rain, hits the 3 people, kills both children, severely injures the mother. Whose fault is that? Well, it's not easy to say that it's anybody's fault. Should the county building have changed, locked those doors? Well, what about the library? Should they have changed something? Were there warning signs or anything? Was there anything that really prevented people from coming across the street? Should the state have been in discussion with them about what they do with that entrance, or is that completely separate functions? One of the things we know is something like this is entirely predictable, but it's not clear that anybody's at fault. But then on the other hand, wouldn't you say, well, if you can predict that something bad like this is going to happen, and you're involved in the decision making, isn't it your responsibility to anticipate that and do something about it? Well, that only happens with collaboration, and that means you have to have communication, which means that you have to have good relationships. And one of the signs that you don't have good relationships is it took them years to correct this. They ended up having fatal accidents multiple times a year at this very site before they finally corrected it last year. Okay? That's when you know you have a cultural problem. And it's not that there was any individual you can point to. You could point to the mother, shouldn't have taken her kids across that street. But blame isn't the same as, say, like, how do we make the best decision here? We've got a cultural problem. So how do we address that? Paying a lot of attention to what are the best companies doing. So the companies that are the best to work for, we generally say these have very good cultures. People like being there. The other thing about places with good cultures is people not only like working there, they have high engagement. When we look at their communication, we have all these ways now of tracking communication across organizations. What we find out is the companies that are the best to work for have the messiest charts when you kind of map their conversations. Companies that aren't very good to work for, their communication structure is really orderly. It goes from the top down and from the bottom up, and communication tends to be vertical both ways. When you look at communication charts, and I'm talking about like maps of how people actually talk, who they call, who they email, and where it goes all over the place. It's sideways, it's diagonal, and it looks like, that's just chaos. You look at it and say, that's a really messy organization. Well, it turns out the messy organizations are the organizations where people are handling all kinds of problems informally. They're not just handling problems through meetings. They're not just handling problems through official communications and memos. They're walking across the hall or down the hall, or and they might be calling up friends. One of the things we find that in the organizations that are really good cultures to work for, a lot of the communications go outside the organization. People are calling up friends in other organizations. Say, I've got this issue. I'm trying to think through how do we handle this, and they talk to somebody that they know. They have people have mentors outside of all this stuff. So it's really fascinating. Communication tends to be chaotic in these places, and it's chaotic because they encourage friendship. They encourage friendship, which is one of the ways in which we informally work through all kinds of issues that we have. Well, this turns out to be the key thing in servant leadership. This program that I've been working with is like how do we think about what our role is as a leader in an organization when we practice servant leadership? Well, what we do is we focus not on, say, how I can advance or how do I attain more power, or even just how do I make my organization more productive or more efficient. What I focus on is how do I help people grow? And so how do I help people grow, that is, become healthier, wiser, freer, more autonomous? And then what is the effect on the greater community? And this comes from Robert Greenleaf, who was the first person to coin this term, servant leadership. What is the effect on the least privileged in society? Will they benefit or at least not be further deprived? This is this idea of the common good. That one of our responsibilities as leaders is to use our organizations as agents for the improvement of our communities. So our responsibility goes further than what my job description is. My responsibility goes to like whoever is impacted in some way by my decisions. Well, this means that then like my decision making has broadened, it's become broader. That means that the people I talk to, the people I consult and confer with whenever I'm making decisions has become broader, which makes it messier. So I was thinking all about all this when I was thinking about like how do we then teach better decision making? And I was working on some different models for how we do this. How do we teach better communication, better decision making within organizations where we know that the best organizations have a kind of chaotic decision making or what appears to be chaotic conversations, communication. And I came across this study by a researcher at Columbia University, and he had been doing something really fascinating. It was a genius experiment. He was taking people in organizations, giving them a washable magic marker, and asking them to write the capital letter E on their forehead. Okay? Really simple. Taking people throughout an organization, all kinds of different job descriptions. Write the capital letter E on your forehead. And what does he find out? It's a real high correlation between how they write that capital letter E and their power within the organization. People who were in high power positions tended to write the letter E differently than people in low power positions. People in low power positions would write the letter E like this. So if I'm standing here and I write the letter E like this, I write it so that you can see the letter E. People in high power positions wrote it like this. Write it so that I can see it, right? And then you have to interpret what my perspective is. Okay. This was fascinating, and here's one of the really fascinating things about it. Somebody might be in a high power position at work and a low power position at home. When they get home, they write the letter E the other way around. And somebody might be in a high position power at home where they write the letter E like this. They get to work and they're in low power position, they reverse it. Okay. What does this tell us about decision making? Well, we subconsciously frame things we tend to, when we're in high power positions, we frame things in the way that we understand it most easily and expect others to figure that out. In low power positions, we tend to frame things so that others understand it. Okay. And I started paying attention to this, like what happens then how people talk about an ethical situation where there's maybe multiple things that could be done, multiple perspectives that can be taken. Do people express themselves differently when they're saying in an informal relationship, just having discussion with friends, versus when they're in a official meeting where you have people with different kind of levels of power? And it turns out that's exactly what happens. And so I came up with this after spending a couple of years just paying attention to how do people actually talk about what's right and wrong and good and bad. When people are together, both in kind of formal meetings, formal settings, and in informal settings, how do people talk about something where they say, I think we should do this, or I think we should do that, or I think that's a bad idea. I think this is a good idea. I think somebody acted really well in this situation. I think another person acted crummy in that situation. We have all ways of expressing this. And what I found out, we can categorize the way people talk about what's right and wrong, good and bad in these 4 ways. And the first way is truth. One of the ways people talk about what's right and wrong, good and bad, is just like what's happening, what's going on. And we can have a lot of disagreement about that. And so first of all, it's just the description of things. But it's this description plus the context. So like, what is company policy, or what is the law that applies in this situation? All those things that go up to make up our picture of what's going on. And I found out something really interesting that I had never noticed before. I noticed that, like, even in settings where you say, like, everybody here is really familiar with what's going on and with the, like, nuances of cases, people would make assumptions that others in the room have the same understanding of the case that they do. And they would move right into kind of arguing why we should do something before they'd settle on what the case is. And I first noticed this when I was serving. I was teaching in Memphis, and I'd been asked to serve on the ethics committee of a hospital. Now I don't have medical training, but I teach ethics. They had brought me on as somebody who teaches ethics, and I'm sitting here, and I'm only catching about half the conversation because a lot of medical terms, and they're talking about like what's going on with the patient, what they're diagnosed with, what are the possible treatment options, and there might be an issue, for example, of say competency or something like that, where you can't necessarily get the patient's consent, or you don't know if you can trust the patient's consent or rely on that legally, and so there's issues coming up, but I just wouldn't understand like the medical diagnosis. And one of the things that I found that I could do and be useful in that is just ask questions. Like, what the hell are you talking about? Like, like if I didn't understand the words, I just, what are you talking about? Like, what is that term? That sort of thing. And here's what I found out. Somebody would jump in with an explanation for me, the novice, about like what's actually going on with this patient that wasn't using the special terminology. Like a doctor would start saying, this is what's going on. Another doctor would say, no, but I don't think, that's not it, right? Or you might have a nurse disagreeing or somebody else, but I would find out like the professionals, once you started asking what's really going on here, you asked for a more detailed description, they weren't all in agreement. But they had jumped over it thinking that they all got it, right? And I would find that this happened over and over again, that there's a tendency to think, like, however I see it, that's the way it is, and others see it the same way, okay? So the first step in ethical decision-making, if you're going to create an environment in which you can actually have a good discussion about what's going on, is to stop and spend some time with the truth. What's really happening, and what's the broader context in which it's happening? Like, what are the laws or the policies or the background, that sort of thing. Second thing is consequences, and this is something that we all get. In fact, this is kind of culturally, Americans tend to be really focused primarily on consequences first, especially when it comes to issues of policy. We focus on, like, what are the effects of what we do, okay? So say we're talking about a patient, we're talking like if we give this medication, what will happen? How will the patient be likely to respond? We're talking about consequences, okay? So consequences, this follows pretty much, this is the way we're trained with scientific thinking. Like look at causes and effects, and so you start with a description of things, say what are our options, how are people affected positively or negatively by different options. Pretty straightforward. Fairness is another category of thinking, and this isn't so much what will happen as a result of an action, but how are people being treated in doing that. So are people being treated? Are they being treated the way you would want to be treated? So the golden rule is an example of fairness. So when you ask the question like, well, how would I feel if I were treated in that way? You might think, well, that's an example of the golden rule, but it's also applying what we call the principle of fairness, where we're asking like, so am I making an exception for myself in this situation, or are you doing that? Are you making an exception for yourself by treating me in a way that I wouldn't agree to be treated normally? So this is also the basis of equality. But you notice the difference here. If you're thinking about fairness as a way of thinking about something, you're not just thinking about what the result of an action would be. You're thinking about how do people feel in being treated that way. Those are very different ways of thinking. Okay. And then finally, there's character, and this is where we think about people's motivations or the character traits. Like, is somebody acting generously or compassionately or kindly? Are they acting rudely or selfishly or naively? They have all these character traits. So this is where we talk about what's the character of the person who's doing the action. Now, so one of the things I found out, like anytime anybody's trying to have a sincere discussion of what's right or wrong or good or bad, they're using one of these four ways of thinking. The other thing I found out, which was really fascinating, is they're usually only using one of them, even though we're all capable of using all four. And just about everybody will use all four at different times, but in any given situation, people tend to pick out one. Why do they do that? Well, it's usually the one that works out with their interests best. Okay? The other thing is people don't know that they're doing that. So this is a subconscious thing. Like from the time we learn to talk, we can use all four ways of thinking. We know how to talk about what's true and what's false. We know how to think about consequences. You know, we teach this to our little kids. You know, don't pull the cat's tail. You know what will happen, right? We teach them fairness. Like, you know, share your toys. How would you feel? Like, if Jenny didn't share that with you, we teach these things. You know, this is, psychologists call it reversibility. Put yourself in the other person's shoes. We teach about character. You should be polite, be kind, say thank you, say please. We teach all of these things from a very early age. By the time you're adults, you've had thousands and thousands of hours of practice at all four. What that means is you're all expert at ethical reasoning. The problem of being expert at it, it's kind of like driving. When you come to a stop sign, you aren't thinking consciously, oh, I've got to put so much pressure on the brakes, say 300 feet before I get to the stop sign. No, you're talking to somebody or you're listening to a podcast, hopefully the Ethical Life podcast. You're listening to that. You see the sign, you're stepping on the brakes, but you're thinking about all kinds of other things. You're doing that all subconsciously because you're an expert at it. You've had thousands of hours of practice driving, right? Same thing with ethical reasoning. Most of it happens at the largely subconscious level. We're just talking. We're just thinking through things, and we do it out. We pick out one of these ways of thinking that works best for us, and we just go with it. And it's not problematic. In fact, that's actually really good. I mean, we'd hardly make any decisions at all if we had to stop and deliberately think through the merits of everything we did all day long. But what if somebody disagrees with us? What if somebody has a different opinion? And what if it's really obvious to us what should be done, but it's not obvious to the other person, or it's really obvious to them, but they're using a different way of thinking about what's obvious to them, and then I'm thinking this way and you're thinking that way. So what I figured out is this is at the source of many of our ethical disputes. Is it's not just that we can't figure out what's right or wrong, it's that we figure it out too easily, and we don't realize that when we get to the point within an organization, when we're having to make a decision together with others, that we're not just disagreeing on what should be done, we're even disagreeing about how to think about it, how to talk about it, and the more we talk, further apart we get. And I first realized just how deep this goes when I had developed this, and I'm using it in classes, and I'm telling my students what this means is you never just pick a position on something and then start arguing for it, because you'll inevitably end up using one of these ways of thinking, and then you'll find yourself like at cross purposes with somebody else. And so when you're talking about something controversial, you pull back a little bit and you start listening. How are they talking about it? And you say, are we starting with truth here? Are we starting with the facts, and then are we moving on to these other ways of thinking? And I'm reminding my students to do this, and I come home one night and I walk in the door, and here's my son, who was 14 at the time, and my wife, who are having an argument in the kitchen about whether he can have a sleepover. And my wife's saying, no, you can't have a sleepover. It's a Thursday. You can have a sleepover Friday or Saturday night, weekend night, but not on a school night. And he's saying, but my friends are having a sleepover. They've already decided. I'm old enough to make decisions for myself. I'm 14. And she's saying, well, I know you're 14, but you want to have a sleepover with your friends. You guys aren't going to get any sleep. You're going to be talking half the night, and you've got school tomorrow. And he's saying, no, we're responsible. We're all going to go to bed early. He says, well, you might intend to go to bed early, but haven't you got a biology test in the morning? You need to study for that. He said, we're all in the same class. We talked about it. We know what we're doing. Okay? I'm old enough to make decisions for myself. We're all going to study for that test together. So what? And the other kids' parents all said that they can have the sleepover. Why can't I have the sleepover like the other kids' parents say they can have it? When I'm a parent, I'm not going to treat my kids like this. And I walk into the middle of this discussion, which you probably never had anything like this at your house, but you walk into the middle of it, and what do? Both of them turn and they say, what do you think? I think I'll take the dog for a walk. That's what I think. No, I just started repeating everything my wife had been saying for the last 15, 20 minutes. Okay. What kind of thinking is my wife using in that situation that I ended up using too? Of these four ways of thinking, consequences, obviously, consequences. Okay? What about our son? Fairness. What? And now, what aligns with our interests? Well, as parents, our interests are making sure that our kid is safe, well educated, that, like all those things. What about our son? Well, he wants more autonomy, he wants more freedom. He wants to be treated like an adult. Okay? So this is actually typical. In that situation, our interests aligned with the kind of reasoning that we used, but we didn't realize we were doing it. So I come in, I start repeating everything my wife's been saying. We're just talking past each other. And son gets frustrated. He ends up stomping upstairs, slamming his door to his room. My wife and I are commiserating how much longer do we have to put up with this irrational teenager. And it turned out to be about 8 years. Until he moved away. He's much better now that he doesn't live with us. But one of the things that happens is we have this myth. We could say, oh, just talk it out. No, if you're using different ways of thinking to talk it out, you actually get further apart. the more you go, the further you get, because you start thinking the other person is either really stupid or they're malevolent. They're just bad people, because either they don't understand it or they don't care. And neither one is a bad thing. And what do you do with somebody who's really stupid or doesn't care? You just quit talking to them. Okay? This destroys cultures. When you're working with people that you can't trust and you can't respect because they're just incapable of well-intentioned reasoning, you can't even talk to them, like, you've destroyed trust in the organization. Okay? Now, that always happens with a few people, but you don't want it with the majority of people thinking that, like, there's half the people in this organization I can't even talk to. Okay. Well, does that happen because you're with bad people? No, it happens in family just because you've got different perspectives, you've got different interests in this. Okay. I didn't even know that I'd done that until I got to school the next day. I'm teaching an ethics class again. We're talking about this, and I'm thinking, oh my God, last night I did exactly what I'm telling you not to do. I just jumped right in, took a position, started defending the position, not even realizing that we were talking right past each other. Because, see, one of the things, once you start taking a position and then defending it, you've got perfectly good reasons. Once you've got perfectly good reasons, you stop thinking. You stop thinking about, are there other good reasons? No, you don't do that. You've got your reasons, then you just defend them. And there generally are other considerations, especially if somebody has a sincere disagreement with you. You've got to stop and ask, are they thinking about this in a way that makes sense from their perspective? And it turns out most times people aren't irrational. They just got a different perspective where they're using a different way of thinking. You've got to figure out what that is so you can have a constructive conversation with them. So I got home that afternoon and I asked my wife, whatever happened to that sleepover? She said, it never happened. I talked to some of the other parents. They all had the same argument at their house. Nobody had agreed to the sleepover. Well, why didn't we start with truth? Why didn't we start here and say, like, call up another family and say, is this sleepover okay with you? Are you going to have it? And they would say, no. Then the reason we didn't do that is because we were using this, consequences, that already gave us a perfectly good answer, and we felt really good about our position. Okay? This is a problem with having power in an organization, is you can dictate, and parents have powers within families. You can say, this is the term of our discussion, and feel really good about it. So how do you correct that? How do you correct that? And this is one of the issues with if you have power in an organization, the only way you correct it is you give people the ability to have some of the power that you own. You distribute the power. This is basically what servant leadership is. By in leadership position, ask, how can I serve? You ask, how do I share the power that I'm granted in virtue of my position here? How do I share the power? And the way you do that is well, there are many ways, but one of the ways in which you do it in decision making is you say, okay, this is how we're going to talk about it, not just from the way I see it. We're going to use something, we're going to use, say, a way of talking about it that gives everybody the ability to enter in at some point. Because what I would notice in many kinds of committees that would meet, there would be somebody who would have more power. Maybe they don't even have official power as the head of the committee, but they had a strong voice, or they have a really strong opinion, or they have kind of standing with regard to others, and they would just take over the discussion, and they would keep moving it back to one way of thinking. Okay? And there might be some other people, like sitting in on the meeting, wouldn't be quite sure of what's right or wrong here, They weren't confident enough to insist on their opinion, but they had questions, and they had really important questions. And if you just open it up for discussion, they wouldn't voice them because it wouldn't be quite sure that they're even relevant, because there's other people that seem really certain. But if we do something like this, and we'd say, okay, let's start here with truth, and then go to consequences, then to fairness of character. And when we move to each way of thinking, we go through a set of questions. Then once you move from consequence over to fairness, and you start talking about fairness, if somebody had come back and say, but if we do that, these things will happen, we'll say, wait a minute, we already talked about the consequences. We can come back and re-examine that now, but we're talking about fairness. What happens when you're saying that everybody has to, at the moment, use the same way of thinking of talking about this. And this gives everybody around the table the ability of spending some time exploring the way of thinking that they have in their head. And in giving them the ability to do that, you're taking away the ability of a single person or a couple people of continually bringing it back to their way of thinking. Because either you haven't got there yet, or you already did it, now they have to be quiet and listen. Does that make sense? And so when we ran some tests, we're just saying where we give groups these really complex problems to solve, and some of them we just say, okay, have a discussion. Take a half hour and have a discussion. Another group, I'd give them this and just, okay, go through this, have a moderator who will keep you on track, using, like, start with truth and then go to consequences, fairness, and then just mark how many people spoke up in each group and how much time did each people use in their talking. We'd find it was really evenly distributed if you use something like this, and not at all evenly distributed if you didn't. Well, what does that do? It evens out your culture. And you get people who are in positions where they might not be really sure of speaking up because they don't even know if their concerns are relevant. You've opened up that space for them to raise a question. So a few years after I developed that, I'm teaching a class, and we'd gone through this 4-way method. So it was a group, like, well, not that big. This is a class of about 15 people, and we'd kind of worked through that, and I'd given everybody one of these sheets. One of the people was Mark Shack, who works at Toro. He was a supervisor there. Because he's an engineer, he took this and laminated it. Like, that's kind of a joke, but it's true. So he laminates this. He tapes it to the side of his computer monitor on his desk, and this is like just a couple days after that class, and he's on his way home. He gets this email 2012. Boy, this is like 14 years ago now this happened. Safety issue, falling light. Light just fell in B38, just missing guy that was walking out of his booth. And here's one of these big light fixtures. It's a large steel fixture with these fluorescent light tubes, as these long fluorescent tubes. And it had fallen from the ceiling. Ceiling's 30 feet high. And there's a whole bunch of these in the building. There's actually like 300 of these light fixtures in the building. This one had fallen. Mark picks up the phone right away, calls up the head of maintenance, says, like, what happened here? He says, I don't know, Mark. I've got somebody on a man lift up there inspecting it. I'll give you a report in the morning. Mark comes in the morning, has a talk with the head of maintenance. He says, well, we figured it out. These are suspended by chains from the rafters. There was a fan nearby that was vibrating a lot, sending vibrations down this rafter. The chain was attached with a bolt, but no lock washer on the nut, and so the nut had come loose, and it fell. But he said we inspected the lights right around it, and they were all installed properly with lock washers. They were all tight, so we're good to go. Mark's thinking, okay, now we know about 5 lights. There's 300 light fixtures in here. But the head of maintenance said, we're good to go. We inspected them. Why would the head of maintenance say that? You're probably thinking like, don't you need to inspect all of them? But that was Mark's question. Why would somebody say that? Do I think about I always think, what's person's interest here? So here's somebody can you imagine getting a man lift? You have to drive this thing around and lift somebody up underneath each one of 300 fixtures in a factory like that. Can you imagine the amount of work it takes to move equipment and shelving and everything around? Can you imagine the amount of time it would take? And then you've got somebody who's already got a whole bunch of work orders, and there's people putting pressure, why aren't you getting my stuff done? And then taking a whole team, a couple weeks, say, to do this, where it's not even sure it's necessary, which means making a whole bunch of people unhappy. So you always think, what are people's interests? And then you think, well, lots of times what people do is they'll make a decision in alignment with their interests and then work backwards to justify it. And if you just argue against it, most people will be able to find some way of thinking about it that is at least defensible. Because we've all got these different ways of thinking and we're pretty good at it. And so Mark, he glances over, and this is taped right onto his computer, and he says, wait a minute, let's take a few minutes just to talk through this. He didn't want to just say, you're wrong, this is what you have to do. He said, let's just talk about this. And they go through truth, like how many light fixtures do we know about? How many don't we know about? And how much will this cost us? Time and money and so forth to do this. Consequences. What happens if we inspect all these lights and we find that we need to replace them? Well, then we would just replace them. It would cost us some time and money and so forth. That would be the consequence of doing that. What if we don't inspect them? What are the consequences? Well, we might miss one that then falls, and what would happen? Well, it could kill somebody, right? Fairness. Let's say you're working every day, you got your workstation right underneath that light. Would you want that one inspected? Yeah, please, I'd want that, yeah. Yeah, treat people the way you would want to be treated. What about character? We claim to be a company that really is concerned about safety. What do people that are really concerned about safety do? Make sure everybody's safe. They just go through and they have the discussion. Mark never says, this is what you should do. They just talk about, work through the ways of thinking. The head of maintenance says, Mark, I think we really ought to inspect all those lights. Do you think that'd be okay? Right? Had to give him time to think through, right? And there's lots of times we all need this. Think through everything. And so they do. They inspect all the lights. They find 7 lights that are improperly installed. At the end of it, the head of maintenance says to Mark, I think we might have saved a life here. But it's not just the head of maintenance, it's his whole crew, which is really pleased about that. And every time I would see Mark, and this be years after that, I would see Mark once or twice a year, he would tell me about some of the case where they had used this just to stop everybody and say, let's think through this together. And he had teams of people would just, anybody could bring it out and say, okay, let's stop and think through this. Because they'd recognize, well, we've had a situation here where I think we should do this, you think we should do that. How do we think through it so that we're not just talking past each other? Okay. This is where we talk about ethical decision making. It's about making the right decision, but it's not just the right decision, it's a decision in a way that builds more trust. And I've got a whole bunch of slides. I'm just going to skip through them. We got 5 minutes, but this is the main thing I wanted you to know. This is a way to build ethical culture. This is something I wasn't even thinking about when I developed this chart. Is this can help build trust, because it's not just a matter of making the right decision. It's a matter of making a decision in a way that builds trust among us so that we get more confident, so we're more willing to reach out and have conversations which prevent crises from coming up later on, so that we have a better culture. And I think this is a primary failing we have in our country right now, is that we don't talk to one another really well, and it's one of the reasons we have this failing institutional trust, going from nearly 50% in 1979 to around, close to 25% today. And then you ask, who do people trust? Themselves or sometimes spouse or family. It's the only people I trust. Well, like, if you only trust yourself, that just means you don't trust anybody. And let me tell you something, self-deception is a really big problem. You're the last person you should trust. Like, the only way to get out of the dungeon of the self is through my relationship with somebody else. If I don't trust anybody, I've got a fool for a friend. So this is a real problem. You have to develop your ability to talk to other people just so that you actually can become trustworthy. And then we've got other issues, and this is issue. I'm going to show you a couple of really quick slides for why I'm concerned about the ability. We're going to have to work harder on establishing communication and trust in the future. Burnout is increasing, anxiety levels are increasing all over the world. This makes people less likely to trust one another and less likely to reach out and talk. We're finding this mainly among Gen Z. So when we got young people entering the workforce, they're more prone to anxiety, and a lot of this is because of cell phones, social media. We know that like young people now, by the time they reach the age 20 to 22, like when I see them in college, most of them have had certainly hundreds of hours, most have had thousands less time face-to-face in interpersonal interaction, reading people's emotions and actually practicing how to have dialogue, face-to-face dialogue and talk. Thousands of hours less practice. This is what economists call opportunity cost, right? Less time practicing. And this means social interaction is harder. Jean Twenge, who just wrote a book called Generations, find two things happen with each generation. We tend to become more individualistic, but grow up more slowly. The typical 18-year-old, their kind of social, emotional maturity now is very comparable to what 14-year-olds were a couple generations back. And we're finding out this is actually, once the iPhone is released, the amount of time hanging out with friends just drops precipitously, continues to drop. So this thing that we rely on for building good cultures in an organization, this is talk, this is conversation, this is the practice that people have. And so it's not something that you can rely on in your organization, you have to work on it. And the way we work on this is through social capital. We build social capital. And this is what we call generalized trust. And we find that social capital builds trust. I won't go into this, but two kinds. Bridging capital. This is the kind of capital, that trust that you build across organizations or within really complex, disparate organizations. And that's always dependent on something they call bonding capital. Bonding capital is interpersonal trust. Another word for this is friendship. So the key thing is, can we work on friendship in our organizations? And I'm starting to believe that this is the key for good culture when we're talking about in organizations, in communities, or in our nation, is we have to work on friendship at a really elemental level. And this has been the work. So the past year I've been working on this book called Finding Your Third Place. It's all about friendship and social connection, why it's important and how to do it. And it's something that we talk about a lot in our podcast, The Ethical Life. So thank you very much. I'm being told I'm out of time. I'll stick around a bit if any of you have questions, so thank you very much.